Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll hand over now to Ms. Lawrence.
Thank you. I've heard very clearly that you have the will and the resolve to restore price stability. Do you feel you have the tools to do so?
I do think we do have the tools, and interest rates are a blunt tool, but they're a powerful one.
Thank you.
And I hope we don't have to use it too much, but I think we do have the tool to get inflation back down again, and we will use that tool to the extent we need to.
Thank you. And so I guess leading a little further on from the questions that Ms. Spender did ask you around that cumulative impact of the interest rate rises that you've just now done already, what sort of analysis are you doing in case there is a more severe response from consumers than expected?
A more severe response, you mean that people cut back spending a lot? Then if that were to happen, then the profile of interest rates is obviously lower, because one of the kind of the critical factors driving the economy is consumer spending. And at the moment, the card data, the payments data we have, and the retail data in our liaison all suggest that people are continuing to spend. Many people are kind of downgrading. They kind of maybe going for a cheaper cut of meat or something, but they're still spending. If it turns out that the big decline in consumer sentiment ends up weighing on spending by more than we think, then that will have implications for the path of interest rates.
So is that the main indicator that you're using to track consumer impact, is around their credit card usage, the discretionary and non-discretionary
spending? We've got a whole, as Lucy talked about before, we've one of the benefits of the improvements in kind of data and kind of collection is that we've got access to a lot more data on card spending, retail sales. We talk to the retailers all the time. Mm-hmm. We track mobility at shopping centres. We've got a whole bunch of things that we can now look at that in previous years we wouldn't have been able to do. So I feel like we've got a better read now on what's going on at any given point in time than we used to. But
so how then, when we consider back in February, you talked about the need to be patient.
Yeah.
But now we've seen 5 successive rate rises. You've talked quite assertively that there will be further ones. How are you allowing time, though, to assess that cumulative impact?
Yeah, in February, on underlying inflation, we just got to the midpoint of the inflation band for the first time in 7 years. We'd had underlying inflation below the midpoint of the target band for 7 years. So in February, inflation was still pretty low. A lot, as I said in the introductory remarks, a lot has changed since then, has it? And the inflation dynamics have moved a lot, and some of them seem pretty persistent. Others will fall away, and so we're just having to factor in the things that will fall away. The lower commodity prices and the improvements in the global supply chains will help, but.
So you spoke about, and in fact, I think Lucia did too, about applying extreme vigour in your analysis, accepting that consumer confidence is weak, but they're still spending.
Yeah.
But how long this will last for, you don't know. Yeah. And yet, in the next breath, you talk about you will increase rates. The question is by how much. Yep. So why isn't taking no action a consideration until you have had time to assess the impact of the lags of the 5 rate rises you've imposed already?
Yeah. I mean, we've been talking about the consumer side. On the business side, business confidence is above average. When you ask businesses how things at the moment, they're saying very, very good, and they're hiring people at record rates. So it's not just a tale of negativity on the consumer side. It's the business side of the economy. Businesses are saying, at least in aggregate, things are very good. In fact, many of them are saying that they're too hot because we can't get the workers. It's an unusual situation where business people tell us we don't really want more customers at the moment.
But in a global context where everybody is taking the same action of raising rates, is taking no action not a strategy in itself?
Well,
and if it is, have you given consideration to that?
We have, but it's a risk management exercise, isn't it? Because if we took no action and say interest rates didn't go any further or we hadn't moved last month, there would be a high probability that the community would think that we're not serious about getting inflation under control, that inflation expectations would adjust, that people would think, well, the Reserve Bank isn't really serious about this, so I better factor in higher inflation into my ongoing.
But what about all the
decision-making.
other factors that the households are looking at, such as the subsidy coming off the fuel price at the end of the month, for example? Obviously, that'll have a flow-through impact. The high level of household debt ratio that people are experiencing. My seat of Hasluck, for example, had 55% of mortgage holders, young families starting out, and 18% renters, so 70% of my electorate are directly impacted by the actions that the RBA take. But in the context of direct action that's happening elsewhere in the economy, I appreciate you talking about, a lot of mortgage holders have buffers and so on, but I think the CBA is suggesting 36% actually don't, and that if you do enact further rate rises between now and Christmas, I think the numbers are quite extraordinary, that some 40%, it could be an increase of 40% on repayments for some third of mortgage holders, which is an awful lot in my electorate, of their repayments, so an increase of 40% on their repayments by the end of the year. So in that climate where they're already quite pinched, but there are other levers being pulled, perhaps in the fiscal policy, how is it that you can't consider waiting and being patient as you were in February this time around, and to see the impact of those 5 rate rises?
Yeah, the main difference with February is inflation. In February,
but are you not seeing though, just take the petrol price subsidy being removed in September? What will be the impact of that? I think it will potentially raise, the price of goods and whatnot, which will potentially have the same impact of dampening consumer demand. If you take no action, what impact will that have on the currency? Potentially making imports more expensive, might have a dampening effect again on consumer demand. So if that's the outcome you're looking for, is there not other ways to achieve that, given you've already taken 5 steps to date?
We don't have any other tools. But
to do nothing is also a tool.
But it's a risk management exercise, because if we were to do nothing and inflation expectations were to adjust higher and inflation were to persist at the higher rates, then that's going to be very bad for the people in your electorate.
It is already bad.
Well, it is. So it's a trade-off.
It will likely get worse by Christmas.
It will get more difficult, but it will be more difficult still if inflation gets entrenched higher. Then we will have to have much, much higher interest rates to get it back down, because we can't have a world where inflation just stays high.
You seem to sometimes come back to looking at things in a vacuum as without looking at all the other factors that are at play. You've spoken about the supply chain easing, the disruptions there easing, which will hopefully lower prices. We've talked about, the government's got different policies, be it around improving housing stocks and supply. You've talked about housing prices coming down. So all these other factors, commodity prices are lowering. So you've talked about all these other factors, but then you still seem to come back. And it's not to say you're wrong. I'm just asking, I don't understand the logic of why you're quite adamant that there has to be a rate rise, as opposed to considering the cumulative impact of the rate rises haven't yet landed, and we know the household debt ratio is at its highest. So how are we layering all of these different elements to still arrive at that we must raise rate rises? Why isn't we may raise rate rises not something that you're speaking to instead?
We've done our best to take into account all the factors that you're talking about. We know there are lags. We know that people are hurting. We also know that businesses are hiring people at record rates, that businesses want to invest, and that there's quite a lot of forward momentum in the business sector. When we do our forecasts, we do our best to take all those various things into account, and when we put a further increase in interest rates in the forecast, we still have inflation next year at 4 and a bit, and it's not until late 2024, so more than 2 years away, that inflation's back to 3%. So even with further increases in interest rates and the pain that many people are experiencing, we still think inflation is going to be above 3% in 2 years' time. And the longer it stays above 3%, the more difficult it's going to become, because expectations adjust. We had the conversation with Andrew, and if that happens, then we have higher interest rates and a recession, which is damaging. So we've got two difficult kind of positions at the moment, a bit of kind of some pain now, and hopefully real wages start rising again next year, against the risk of not doing anything, just sitting on our hands and having inflation stay higher.
Well, I don't think anyone is sitting on their hands. I think there are a lot of other, and that's my point, there are other elements. It wouldn't be a case of sitting on your hands. I'm not suggesting that that's how the perception or the experience would be. And you talked about, some around wage growth. I appreciate, that we're a wonderful place of full employment, but we heard this week that some 900,000 people are actually having to take a second job because perhaps their wages that they're receiving are just insufficient to be able to make ends meet. That's obviously going to be amplified by your intention to increase rate rises, increase the interest rates. So previously you've stated that you feel 3.5% wage growth is sustainable. I just would like to see how you feel about that in the context of the pressure and the constraints that people are already experiencing without yet that impact of the interest rate rises fully landing in the households yet.
Yeah. I've said previously that I thought 3.5% was a reasonable anchor point for thinking about what type of wage increases our economy can deliver over the medium term, and that was on the basis that expect to deliver 2.5% inflation and labour productivity growth, let's say 1%, and workers should get their share of that. So 2.5 plus 1 would give 3.5% growth in a broad measure of wages. I think that's a reasonable anchor point. If productivity growth is slower than that, then 3.5% will be too high. Mm. If productivity growth is stronger than that, as it was in the 1990s, because businesses and government instituted reform, then we can do better than that. So it really comes down to productivity growth. In the short run, inflation's higher, isn't it? And so, as I talked about this before, that well, it's very difficult for people to experience declines in their real wages this year. I mean, I know it's really hard for people, particularly when interest rates are rising. So there's a natural tendency to say, well, we shouldn't allow that to happen, that wages should go up faster to compensate people for the inflation. I mean, I can understand why people think that. It's kind of at some level it makes sense, doesn't it? But if you accept that proposition and wages grow by 6% to compensate people for inflation, what do you think inflation will be next year? It'll still be high, and we'll need to say to people, we get compensation for that because we don't want you to suffer a decline in your real wages. And then the following year, inflation's high. And that would have to be responded to with much higher interest rates. So while it's difficult and it's very hard for people to experience a decline in real wages this year, I think the alternative, sadly, is much more difficult.
And just one final question, if I may, on a completely different note. As you're right to do, on the 19th of July 2021 and again on the 27th of January 2022, you met with the then Treasurer Josh Frydenberg. I note that the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was also in attendance. Were you made aware of the fact that the RBA had two treasurers for that period, from May last year to May this year? And was this dual arrangement ever reported to you as the Governor?
No, it was not. I was as surprised as the rest of the community.
Thank you.